Hey class, it's Miss Chaudhry here with your first section of notes for our unit on biodiversity. So this is just kind of an introduction to what is biodiversity. So what is biodiversity? Section 1. Biodiversity is an important term in examining ecological health. It's probably the biggest metric that we use to examine the increase or decrease in health in any given ecosystem. And there's lots of different ways that we measure or examine how biodiversity is and what kind of biodiversity an area has. Very simply put, biodiversity is exactly what it sounds like, the diversity of life, bio meaning life. So it's just the way that we look at or examine how much different stuff exists in the world or in a particular ecosystem. The stuff is what gets varied when we're looking at different kinds of biodiversity. And that's really what this section of notes is going to focus on, is the different kinds of biodiversity that we consider important and that we look at. So biodiversity can include the number of different species in an area, the different forms of life, the different life-sustaining processes, and even, and maybe especially, the different kinds of genetics, all of which can allow life to survive in all of the different conditions found on our planet. So these are the things we're going to delve into a little bit more deeply. So first is species diversity. And species diversity looks very simply at how many different species are there, either, again, globally or within a particular biome or habitat. Okay, so it's just a count of the number of different species in an area. Typically speaking, when people use the word biodiversity, this is the definition they mean. It is the simplest to calculate. It's really the only one that we can very easily calculate. So it's easy to measure and examine, but it's also just very intuitive and easy for us to say, oh yeah, I see 1,000 different kinds of organisms living in this forest. I know what that means. I know what it looks like. They obviously all look like different things. Okay. Looking at species diversity, there's just some kind of background information we want to also have. So just some other things to know. The number of known species on Earth is about 1.7 million. Obviously, this is a number that changes a little bit all the time based on what's going on in the world. That being said, that's just the number of species we know about. And know about means that we have examined them, we've classified them, we've given them names, we've started to look at their relatedness to other species that we've identified. But it is by no means accounting for all of the species on the planet, because there's really a large amount of things that we don't know about, that we haven't classified, that we haven't discovered is actually maybe different than a current population, or in some cases live somewhere where we've never interacted with them, never tracked them before. We estimate that there's about 10 million different species on the planet. How do we estimate that when we can't really know? We estimate that by looking at the number of species that are discovered within a time frame and the rate of discovery, how that's increased and decreased over time. And so we can look at all of like our history of monitoring different organisms, of classifying and discovering different organisms, and we can use that data and the amount that has been found over certain periods of time and how much that amount is changing as we move forward and develop better technology and continue to explore. And we can extrapolate out a guesstimate. That being said, it is a guess, but it's a guess based on some good scientific data. So when we look at known versus unknown, we're breaking this down just for like the major animal kingdoms in this image. So you can see the ones that we've discovered the most of. Again, this is all based on estimation of how many we think are out there. But we can look at the type of organisms we found the most of versus the least. So mammals by far are the species that we are most familiar with, followed closely by birds and then reptiles, and also fish actually is a pretty high percent. But you can see that mammals we've discovered and have classified, named about 5,500-ish species. We estimate there's about 5,600 species in existence. Why is that number so high? Mammals tend to be larger, which makes them easier to see, interact with, and they live in a lot of places that we do. So we come into contact with them more regularly than other species. Birds, reptiles, even fish, again, same kind of thing. They're larger species. We interact with them. We use them for lots of things, and so we're far more familiar with them. And also, they largely live on land, and living on land is, I don't know if you know this, but where we live. So again, we come in contact with them more. Um, by far, the types of species that we know the least about are those that are either very, very small in the case of insects, or they are things that live primarily in the water, like crustaceans and mollusks. And especially in marine waters, which is why like we still know lots of fish because there are also lots of fish living in freshwater. But with crustaceans and mollusks, we find more of those in salt waters, which are more difficult to examine just because the oceans are rather deep. And some places are very hard to get to. Insects, we only estimate we know about 20% of the insect species on the planet, and that is largely because there are so many. They are smaller, but also like the differences between some species of insects are so finite that we can go decades thinking that two different populations are the same species, only to realize that there is some trait or some genetic distinction that actually does make them separate. Insects, also because they have a shorter lifespan, can do what we call speciating more quickly, which means they develop into genetically distinct species because they go through their life cycles a lot more quickly than, say, like large mammals. And so they have more offspring, which can create genetic changes much more quickly. You'll notice on here we don't look at things like bacteria or fungi or plants. Um, so this is a very small window of organisms. This isn't considering lots of other living things. Okay? And bacteria, obviously, we have lots of bacteria we have know nothing about because they're very small. Viruses, too, although it's debatable whether we consider viruses alive or not to count in these totals. But I think our current situation is a really good example of things that exist that we don't really have on our radar because we don't know about them until they start to impact us. So that's species diversity. Again, it's the number one type of diversity we think about, but there are other ways that we measure biodiversity. The next is ecological diversity. Ecological diversity looks at the different variety of habitats, the different kinds of communities or areas where like organisms are interacting with their habitat and each other, and also the different kinds of ecological processes that happen within ecosystems and between ecosystems. So thinking about some of those things like how animals or how other organisms, I should say, get their energy. Okay, that's an ecological process. The recycling of nutrients within the carbon cycle or the nitrogen cycle. That's all part of that, but also part of functional diversity, which we'll talk about in a moment. So the different kinds of habitats in and of themselves are a form of diversity. And the more different kinds of habitats, different kinds of biomes we have, the more stable and healthy that makes our entire planet. So things like different kinds of forests and deserts and grasslands, different kinds of streams with different depths, different types of mineral content that form the base or the banks of the stream. All of that helps to create a wider variety of ecosystems. And again, different ways that life then adapts to those ecosystems. And we have genetic diversity. This is probably one of the hardest things to really examine, but also one of the most important things when we talk about the health of some of our species. So, genetic diversity looks at all of the different genes, all of the different potential genetic combinations that are contained within members of a population. Okay, so all of the different potential genes that one group of a species can have. Okay. The more variety we have, the better that species is able to potentially survive in the future. Because when lots of organisms become really genetically similar, and that increases the likelihood for genetic health problems, but it also means that if some environmental change happens, it is less likely that members of the population have the genetics to best adapt to that change. And we'll look at that in a second. Okay. So genetic diversity, again, important for the survival of species. And this becomes especially important when we talk about some of our current situations with endangered species and our efforts to or to increase those populations. As the genetic diversity, or as the population, I should say, of a species decreases, naturally the genetic diversity also decreases. You have less things, there will obviously be less genetics. And that creates what's called a bottleneck effect. Bottleneck effect can be very dangerous for a population because even if that population is able to increase, the genetics don't magically increase. There are obviously mutations. We know that from biology, that mutations are random. They're often not actually helpful, and they don't happen in a discernible pattern. So, as the population starts to increase back up, you might have more individuals, but you don't have more genetics. And that means that all of the individuals left are really closely related to one another. They have, again, that likelihood to suffer from the same genetic problems, to be weak to the same kinds of ecological shifts and changes, which then makes them, again, more vulnerable. So we have a very real life example of this that we're experiencing in the world with our cheetah populations, actually. So cheetahs, due to their habits, due to the size of territory that they need in order to successfully hunt and breed and raise their young, we've seen a huge decrease in cheetah populations. There's just not enough large sections of land as humans continue to colonize and build up their societies and spread out their need for agriculture and cities and resources. There's not enough large chunks of land for big groups of cheetahs to successfully live and thrive. So their population has decreased a lot, which means that the population that remains is really genetically inbred, aka it's really genetically similar. To the point where today almost all of the cheetahs that live on the planet are almost genetically identical. There's very little diversity, very little change in their genetics from one individual to another. So, as I said, that makes it more likely that they inherit genetic diseases. Okay? The image on the screen right now shows kind of the concern of that. Typically speaking, a female cheetah in like an ideal world is going to mate with multiple males while she is sexually receptive, aka while she can actually produce offspring. In like domesticated animals, we refer to that as their heat cycle. Okay. So during that time, she would typically mate with multiple males. In order for a male to win her favor to breed with her, they typically engage in a series of foot races that female cheetah is looking for the strongest and the fastest males to be the fathers of her cubs. When she has her cubs, then there's lots of genetic variability because there are multiple fathers giving their genetics, which means that the cubs are not all genetically identical to one another. They have obviously DNA from their mother, but they have different DNAs from different fathers. That creates more variability, and that in the long term gives them a higher survival rate. Because even if, say, a disease is going through the savannah and some of the cubs get sick, it's likely that some of the other cubs are not going to get sick because they have inherited a different immune system from their father and different genes and different strengths. Okay. In the other scenario, when there's not a lot of either there's not a lot of different males to choose from, and or uh, there are lots of very genetically similar males. Okay, even if she is able to mate with other males, there's not a lot of difference. Okay, that creates very low variability amongst her cubs. It means that they're all potentially susceptible to the same health issues or the same environmental concerns, and so they don't have the disparity or the difference in genetics for some of them to be able to rebound in the wake of those changes. Okay, we talked about in our last unit looking at things, different pressures that cause evolution, different disturbance events that allow a species to adapt to new scenarios. The less genetics you have, the more difficult it is for your species as a whole to roll with those changes and come out of that disturbance event successful and still around. Functional diversity looks at all of the different biological and chemical processes or functions needed for the survival of individual species, but then also biological communities. So the places where those species live and interact with one another. And so this really, more than the ecological diversity, this is looking at kind of the things, the mechanics that make ecosystems work. Things like that energy flow, the cycling of different kinds of matter like carbon and nitrogen and phosphorus and water, even. And so that looks at kind of all the mechanics of ecosystems and how life continues to work, interact with one another, and survive. Okay. So those are kind of the major different types of biodiversity that we look at. Again, species diversity is very easy to look at and classify, and it's important for sure, but it's not the only important thing. Like, it's not enough that we just have lots of different organisms. We also need to have lots of different ecosystems and lots of different processes that allow them to flourish. And again, especially to adapt and change as the world around them adapts and changes. The last thing we want to talk about in this set of notes is something that is the exact opposite of biodiversity, and that's a concept called monoculture. So monoculture basically means that there's very little diversity of species, especially. We only have one species. Okay. You can see, like, this is a picture of just like some good old fashioned field of grass. Okay, same general species, might be a Kentucky blue, might be any other, it doesn't really matter. But just one species of grass. Okay. And for now, in this picture, that grass looks pretty good. Okay. But what happens if there's a drought? Okay. All of that grass has the same water tolerance level, the same nutrient needs. If suddenly that nutrient or that water level is gone, all of that grass dies. Okay. We have a really prominent historical example in human history that really displays why monoculture is dangerous. And that's actually the Irish potato famine. So if you don't know much about the Irish potato famine, it was basically this point in time when in Ireland, prior to the potato famine, a lot of the lower economic class individuals in the country lived on diets that really, really heavily featured, surprise, the potato. Okay, potatoes are pretty caloric. They have lots of minerals and vitamins in them. They're relatively easy to grow. They do well in a lot of diverse soil conditions. They're cheap and they make a lot. One potato plant can produce a lot of pounds of calorie rich food. And so during a good chunk of Irish history, many people, most people, especially poorer people, lived primarily on diets that were strictly potato based. They'd eat upwards of a dozen plus potatoes a day in order to get their calories. It was cheap, it was effective, it worked, which is fine when potatoes are growing well. But what happened during the potato famine is a blight came through a certain rust, and it killed off, it withered as they grew most of the potato crop. And so all of these people who had been relying on this one food source suddenly didn't have it. And so lots of people starved, lots of people got very sick, and a lot of people left Ireland. Maybe some of your ancestors, I know some of mine, came to America and many other places as well because they literally just couldn't access food anymore. There wasn't that crop there to support them. And so this is why monoculture can be really dangerous, because when every section of a population is focusing on this one resource, and that one resource is suddenly gone, every living thing that depends on that resource suddenly has no other outlet. Okay? So, takeaways from this: monoculture is dangerous, biodiversity is what a thriving ecosystem really needs. A thriving planet needs biodiversity. Okay? It's just like work and careers. You know, it's great to say that one career is really important, but really all of our careers are important. We need all of those different jobs, all of those different roles, whether you want to go into a trade, whether you want to go into the medical field, whether you want to go into the military, whether you want to work at a store, own a business. We need all of those things for our society to survive and thrive. Okay? We all rely on all of those different services at different points, whether it's the people who are making our food in a store, or in a factory, the folks who are growing our food, the folks who are keeping us safe and protected, the folks who are providing medical care, the folks who are providing art and music and things that bring us joy. All of those things have a place. Okay. Biodiversity is a beautiful thing that allows life to really thrive. And whether that's human culture or that's ecology, we need that and we need to protect it. And that's really what we're going to start to talk about as we move forward in the unit. First, we're going to look at some ways that we can actually like track populations and determine population size. So you'll have a couple of labs coming up where you're going to look at different systems we use for figuring out population size. And then we're going to start to look at how do we protect that super important biodiversity. So I hope you're all well. I hope this made sense. As always, you can feel free to email me questions or pop into office hours. I hope you guys are well. I miss you, and I look forward to seeing you again.